Hi, I'm the Brewmaster. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. Today, we're going to do something just a little bit different. You see, normally when I build a new deck, I like to start with the cards that I have on hand. And I like to build it in paper. Identify the gaps, and then trade with friends or visit the local card shop or order the missing pieces online. But today we're going to build this deck purely theoretically. Today, we're going to build the ultimate casual deck that is playable in every casual format. So pull up a chair and have a seat at the table. And whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful ruffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So I had an interaction with a customer earlier this week, and they asked me to explain the different formats in Magic the Gathering. I started by explaining that there are casual formats that are generally separate from the competitive or sanctioned formats, and that those sanctioned formats usually represent different power bands by how far back you're allowed to go in the card pool, with standard being only the cards that came out in the last couple years, and vintage being every card that's ever been printed. And then on the casual side, the most popular format is Commander, and it essentially represents every card ever printed, minus a short ban list, all things considered. And they asked me an interesting question. Is it possible to build a standard deck that is playable in Commander? The short answer is no, and even if you do build a 100-card deck, where 60 of those cards are used in the standard deck, you are probably handicapping yourself pretty aggressively on how powerful that Commander deck is, and you are definitely handicapping yourself by playing a singleton standard deck. It's just far too limited to really be enjoyable in those formats. But it got me thinking, is there a way to build a single deck that is playable in multiple formats? Obviously on the sanctioned side, that's going to be tricky. I don't know that there's any modern decks that are even viable in Legacy, and Legacy decks that are viable in Vintage. Obviously, there's no standard deck that is going to be viable in Modern, or pretty much anything in between. So if we are trying to build a singular deck that can be played in multiple formats, we should be focused on the casual side. And I will say, recently there's been a big push for every new casual format to have their own deck construction rules, but most of them lean pretty heavily on Commander. Some combination of singleton, short ban list, card pool containing every card ever printed in Magic. And so that brings us to today's challenge. Build one deck that is playable in as many of those formats as possible. Obviously, we're going to start with our Commander deck, 100 cards. As many of those formats require fewer than 100 cards. And then by shaving things out of this, we want one deck to contain subsets of all of those different decks. And the deck should be playable at 100 cards as both Commander and Canadian Highlander. As they are both 100-card singletons, it seems like a natural fit. But our first step is going to be seeing which cards are even legal. And depending on which casual formats you include in this, that list can be fairly long. Alright, so our first order of business is identifying which casual formats we can fit in one deck. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we are starting with Commander and Canadian Highlander, and we're going to balance the Commander ban list with the points list from Canadian Highlander. We need to make sure that we meet both of those restrictions. But the sets underneath that, the other decks that we want to build out of this, I'm going to focus primarily on Oathbreaker and Tiny Leaders. There's a few other formats that kind of naturally fit into this general archetype. There are things like Conquest, which is an 80-card format that has an expanded ban list, but it also bans out every reserve list card, and just the way that I'm planning on building the other decks, it's not a supernatural fit. So I do believe that we can actually go further than what we currently have but at some point I think you're constraining yourself a little too much and you're not actually going to build super functional versions of those decks. If you do end up brewing one of these, I would love to see which formats you can fit into a single deck, but I'm going to primarily stick to those four. So going down the list, it's going to be Tiny Leaders at 50 cards, Oathbreaker at 60 cards, Commander at 100 cards, and Canadian Highlander at 100 cards. But to meet all of those requirements, we need to start by looking at the things that we can't play. So let's start with the Commander ban list. It's not super long, but there are a lot of cards on it, and when you look at the Canadian Highlander points list, a lot of those cards kind of get spoken for here. So those are removed. Then we move down to Oathbreaker, and Oathbreaker took out a lot of the fast mana stuff and some of the other kind of uniquely powerful cards in Oathbreaker. So those get removed as well. Moving down to Tiny Leaders, well, now we're looking at only mana cost 3 or less, and there's a few things that sort of break the game, and those end up getting banned as well. All of a sudden, our ban list is looking a little bit more substantial. And our points list for Canadian Highlander has shrunk to just a handful of cards. Now, if we want to optimize how many points we're able to run in one deck, well, that kind of locks us into either playing some sort of Grixis combo pile or some sort of Timur combo pile. I say combo because Underworld Breach is the real powerhouse that we have left on this list, and I really want to try to make use of it. So my plan is to build Timur. And we're going to do that by leaning on our good friend here, Underworld Breach, the combos that kind of align with that, in addition to a couple of the Planeswalkers at the bottom of that points list that are real powerhouses. And I think by using Renin 6 as our Oathbreaker, we can build a fairly competitive list. Now that does lock us into certain archetypes of the way that we play the game, namely a focus on lands and lands going into and out of our graveyard. So we want to make sure that we choose a Tiny Leader and a Commander that play well with those. So that brings us to the big reveal. Which decks are we going to try to build into this singular deck? At the very bottom, in our Tiny Leaders deck, we are going to focus on Flubs the Fool. A deck that I've really wanted to build, but every attempt I've made has led to just kind of unfun game interactions. But Tiny Leaders is kind of an unfun game interaction format, so it seems like a natural fit. We're going to focus on land interactions and the ability to draw a whole bunch of cards in one turn, ultimately comboing off with some variant of Underworld Breach and Brainstorm. We have a couple other lines that we're including in the deck just to combo, but we do lose a lot of those big notable combo lines with Underworld Breach, including all of the Mox Opal or Mox Amber or whatever variant you can get to there, in addition to any Lion's Eye Diamond lines. So now our Underworld Breach lines look a little bit less stable. We're going to be focused on looping Grim Monolith to get infinite colorless mana if we are using some sort of grinding station combo. Alternatively, we might be able to do something with Lotus Petal and a Brain Freeze, but it'll be very difficult to deck ourselves out and get to those cards. We are running a Laboratory Maniac and a couple other ways to draw cards to win the game right off the bat, but we do lose out on Thassa's Oracle, as it is on our expanded ban list. So we have a pretty tight 50 cards that can churn out a lot of damage and interaction off of those lands, but now we need to find a way to fit that into our bigger decks. I think we shake it up a little bit, and when we go to our Oathbreaker deck, we're actually going to remove all of that blue. This means we lose Flub the Fool. It also means that we lose our Brain Freeze portion of our Underworld Breach combo. And as such, at some point, I think it's worth it to cut the Breach altogether. We're going to build our Oathbreaker deck centered on Renin 6, probably running either Crop Rotation or Gamble, depending on what we are really trying to do with the deck. But we are going to have a fairly powerful lands engine that just accrues value very quickly, and then can ramp up to some big game-ending combos. We have a couple infinite mana lines in there that get us to a Walking Ballista to close out the game, and just a couple other good engine cards to accrue that value over time and really start taking over. It's going to be a very fast, aggressive deck, and I know Renin 6, while not being absolutely the tippy top of the meta in Oathbreaker, is definitely up in those higher tiers. So I feel confident that this deck, even though we are placing some constraints on ourselves with the way that we're building our deck, can definitely hang. But now, with those two decks, if we shuffle them together, we don't have a lot of wiggle room for what we're adding to the deck to get to 100. And there's two main considerations that we have. How do we build a deck that plays well with a commander, while still playing well without a commander? And with that in mind, I think we need to find a commander that kind of satisfies all of the benefits of having it constantly on hand, while allowing the deck to perform without actively needing that commander in play. Because if you think about some of these more combo line-centric decks, I am a very big fan of running the Gitrog monster. But if I don't have the Gitrog monster in the command zone, that deck kind of falls apart. I need a whole extra tutor because it does nothing without the Gitrog monster in play. So which commanders accrue value passively? Give us things for stuff we're doing anyways. And I think there's a very short list of cards that come to mind saying something like that. And to me, the card that stands out as being Timur-centric while giving you passive value is actually going to be Omnath, Locus of Creation. And I know that this is adding a fourth color into the deck, but we're not going to use it very heavily. Our goal is to tutor for lands aggressively. We're already running a lot of land search and land generation in this deck, and it also gives us a benefit for playing a lot of lands in one turn. If we can loop those things together, well, it'll be pretty easy to hit a fourth color, so we can pretty regularly get to our commander on turn 3 or 4. We're not really trying to turbo it out. Again, we're just looking for passive value with this. The rest of the deck continues to perform as it did before, but now we're bringing some of those combo lines back in. So we have a few of those good tutors, we have a few infinite wins in there, we have a few ways of slowing the game down and adding a little bit of extra removal with the addition of white. This gives us a better control game and allows us to do better into some of these more aggressive decks that we might run into. It's not going to play at CEH levels, but it will solidly be a mid or high tier bracket 4 deck. So I'm really excited to see that deck play. But let's look at this from a different perspective. Because in Canadian Highlander, you're playing one-on-one. And in Canadian Highlander, we don't always have access to Omnath. So how do we want to build this deck to actively pursue that 1v1 strategy? Well, we're already running a little bit of removal from white that's targeted, and 1v1 that gives us a pretty good suite of answers for what our opponents might be doing. We're ramping pretty heavily, and we have a couple planeswalkers that can just sit and play and accrue value over time. And we still have access to all of those major combo lines that we have in the commander deck. We still have grindstone lines and underworld breach lines and a variety of other things that can go infinite. Because killing one player or killing 3 players is not all that different for a deck like this. We're a little bit light on tutors because of the natural restrictions of this deck that we are trying to build, but it does put us in a position where we can pretty easily ramp out, do all the normal things that we want to do, and still get ahead of our opponent. Because our game plan is fairly agnostic for what our opponent is trying to do. The last note that I would make on a deck like this is that it's pretty easy to change cards in and out. And even with the expanded ban list that we are bringing to the table here, there are a lot of cards that we can still use in the game. And there's nothing saying that you have to use as many points as possible in Canadian Highlander. You can ignore that point list entirely, and you can ignore every game changer on that list as well. And you can ignore all of the ban lists from several other formats and still build a fairly competent Commander, Tiny Leader, Oathbreaker, and Canlander deck. So I'm curious what you might come up with. What approach would you take? Would you lean into the monocolored angle? Maybe capitalize on just a handful of those Canadian Highlander points cards. Go full mono blue, just using Treasure Cruise, Intuition, and a couple of other things to power out a couple of interactions that you're trying to focus on. And you can build a fairly strong control deck. You don't care so much about the mana generation or any ramp you might be losing. And you can build a very strong 1v1 deck that just monitors card advantage very carefully. Or you could take a completely different approach. You could build all 5 colors. Maybe start with a 2-color commander for tiny leaders, and then ramp up to 3 for some Nicole Bolas shenanigans, or something like Sarkin the Unbroken for your Oathbreaker deck. I think there's a lot of different directions that you can go, and a lot of different ways to build this deck. And ultimately, that's the goal. We want to have one deck that we can take with us wherever we go. And if we end up sitting across from somebody who's got a Canadian Highlander deck, you can say, great, I've got a deck for that. Or if they say, you know, my group's been wanting to try out Oathbreaker, you can say, give me a second. I'm going to pull 40 cards out of this deck, and I have an Oathbreaker deck ready to go. Maybe even for something like Conquest, where it's an 80-card format with an expanded ban list. I'm sure there's a way that you can put a deck together that meets that as well. Removing all the fetch lands and the dual lands, it'll limit the power level of the deck, but I think that can be a really cool option. And you're not actually cutting the power level of your deck by that much, especially if you leave some of those cards in those 20 cards that you're cutting. I'm taking a fairly aggressive approach to this, limiting the cards throughout the entire deck that meet those various ban lists, but there's nothing to say that you can't have some of those banned cards in the rest of the commander deck. The cards banned in Tiny Leaders, you just don't play them when you're playing Tiny Leaders. And I think you can actually go further with this, beyond just having 100 cards that contain all of these decks. I am a big proponent of having a sideboard for your commander decks to adjust the power level up and power level down as needed to meet the rest of the players where they're at the table. And there's nothing to say that you can't do a similar thing with a sideboard for other ban lists or other options for the deck to turn it into whatever format you need. I'm really looking forward to building this deck out and finding cards that fit and ways to tinker with it. I'll have a link to the deck. It's in progress right now. It's sitting at about 170 cards. And over the next couple weeks, I'll probably pare that down to a pretty clean 100 with every card tagged for which formats it's actually used in the deck. But I would love to see your build. I'd love to see other innovation, people blending other cards and formats in unique ways to build some really cool casual decks that meet all of these requirements at once, or none of these requirements, playing a ban list optional deck. I think it can be a lot of fun, and I would love to see more casual formats like this rise up. Frankly, I would like to see more casual formats that don't care about what deck you're running. You want to sit down and play this new format? Well, it punishes certain formats and rewards others. Maybe you can play your Tiny Leaders deck into other commander decks with this specific format. Or maybe every deck at the table can just be commander, but the format itself changes the scope of the game. Not like a plane chase changes the scope of the game, but maybe the way you sit around the table, or move around the table, or change decks, or interact with the players only to your left or right, or have different roles that you are trying to accomplish. There's a lot of different ways of playing Magic and a lot of other things that you can do that really shake things up. Next week, we're going to get into a few of those, talking about how we handle different pod sizes and other ways that we can play the game to satisfy those 3-player, 5-player, 6-player tables without making the game last until next Tuesday. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be really fun. It's been really nice talking to you.